research is science, but publishing is an art. So in arts, there is no fundamental truth, and the range of opinions is much wider than in science. So please feel free to disagree with everything that I say. And then Sergio had also suggested that I could give my experience with one of the papers, the genesis as a research idea, the research process, journal selection, interaction with editors and reviewers and so on. So that would also be part. Now, so this is the basic idea, how to overcome these obstacles and get a paper accepted. Now, for journal selection, quite often people will say, my paper was accepted in such and such journal with 9 point something impact factor. But actually, impact factor, it's once the people who published JCR, earlier it used to be somebody else, now Clairvait has got it. Their representative had come to Centrum. And I asked him, why do you have two different indices, the Science Citation Index and Social Science Citation Index? He explained that in the Science Citation Index, the impact factor goes very high. And in social sciences, it is lower. And that's why quartile is more important than the impact factor. Now, so that's why they divided into two parts. The Scopus has gone further. They divide their journals in several subjects. And in each subject, there is a Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4. Now, firstly, Scopus has more journals. And secondly, Scopus, because when you report, you can, supposing a journal is Q1 in education and Q3 in management, you can report as Q1. So the overall number of Q1 and Q2 in Scopus is much higher. So earlier, Centrum used to consider only what was then ISI. Then they also started considering Scopus. So now there is a bigger scope for publications in various journals. Now, the main thing is that there is a hierarchy of journals, but the correlation between the ranking and acceptance rate is positive, but it's not very strong. It's not like one that higher journals will have a higher acceptance rate. So if one can find out the acceptance rate, it's very useful, because there is no point in submitting a journal where acceptance rate is 3%, 4%. Then it's like a lottery. The last time, there was a lecture from one of the publishers, and the good thing that he did was the Excel sheet that he sent. Mainly, it was an advertisement, like he wants people to publish in the journals of his company. I think it was Emerald. But he gave the acceptance rates of many of the journals. So that's a good indication on if you want to get published, that it should have a good ranking as also a high acceptance rate. Then it's a win-win situation. But then the journals have a hierarchy. The highest are FT 50. Now, it is not worthwhile for ordinary people or even for brilliant people to submit in FT 50. The reason is that in most of the journals, the acceptance rate is very small, and then it becomes like a lottery. Many people say, for instance, there is a famous paper in economics called Market of Lemons. It was rejected by many good journals like American Economic Review and so on, because it was a new idea. It was economics of information. But fortunately, the author he had more time, and he was very persistent and went on sending to other good journals. And finally, it was published in Journal of Public Economics. And a few years back, he got a Nobel Prize for this stream of economics. But most of us are not of that level. So it's a lottery. If somebody has the time and patience, so one of the papers can be sent there for one rejection after another, and maybe it'll get through. But normally, it is not worthwhile. Then comes JCR Q1 and Q2. After that, JCR Q3, Q4, and Scopus Q1, Q2. The reason for this, why Scopus is lower, as I explained, and then the last comes Scopus Q3, Q4. Then there is also a category that some Scopus journals are there and they are not in the quartile. And there are some journals which are in social science index and social science citation index, etc., but they are not in JCI. Now, those, it may not be worthwhile submitting there because the publication is easy. And then if one gets addictive to sending and getting published in low-level journals, then it's difficult to move out from the comfort zone and go for a higher-level journal. So the best would be to focus on just these three categories. That is JCR Q1 up to Q4 and Scopus Q1 up to Q4. So now dealing with editors is the first problem because they can reject straight away. It may be what you think is a good paper, but doesn't even go to the referees. Why do they do it? So first thing is, editors are not salaried employees. They are doing just for higher journals. They are doing for the prestige of it. I mean, if you editor of a great journal, so it adds to your stature. For low-level journals, they do it because they have nothing better to do. So, okay, let me write something on my CV. So that's why they do it. Now, the agenda, which is never stated, is to get the journal up in the rankings. So they would like a paper in which their own journal is quoted. Now, this is the kind of thing which is a technique which is used by predatory journals very badly, but then even respectable journals want that you should quote their paper. Now, so even once you've decided which journal to aim for, one has to go through the back issues of that journal and somehow make some of their papers relevant. I would suggest that at least 2 papers should be quoted. Now, which ones to quote? There is a 5-year impact factor and there is a 2-year impact factor. So best is to quote 2 papers which have been published in 2020 and 2021, because when the review comes up in June, their 2-year impact factor will rise. If it is not possible, then from 2017 to 2021, so that at least their 5-year impact factor rises. Now, citation in the same journal is not considered by the agencies, whether it is more so by Scopus, if it is too high. But most journals have just about 5%. So they cannot go whole hog. This was done to eliminate predatory journals, that supposing you start quoting your own journal. But even so, editors want that you quote their own journal. The other problem with the editors is because they're not paid people, they're just there. They don't read the paper. They read only the abstract, which of course is on the top, and then they read introduction. Now, in introduction, what they want to see is, and they don't even read the whole introduction. They just want to see what research you want to do, and how important is it? Is it worthwhile? So, of the 3 methods to avoid disk rejection, one is to quote the same journal, and if possible, also quote one or two sentences instead of just putting in the bracket, like say this has been done by so and so, and in a bracket you write four citations, out of which two are from that journal. That's good enough. But then it's even better if you write in such and such article, this has been mentioned and I want to expand on it, or some such thing. Then, of course, then the chances are even better. The second is that early in the introduction, you need to say what I want to do. Now, it's supposing like one time I was writing, so supposing somebody wants to write on something that is affected by Sendero Luminoso. Now you start describing what is Sendero Luminoso is, which is very relevant. Then you describe the situation of Peru and all that. And finally, then you describe, this is the industry I'm talking about. And finally, you write that this is what I want to do. Now, the editor doesn't even reach that stage. Because they don't read the whole, even the whole introduction. So you have to do it early. And then you have to make it seem important, because straight away you can't say this is a very important subject. So that's why it's an art. Somehow you have to, without saying so, make the reader feel that what you are going to see, what you are going to say is important. So that if I'm certain that if a paper has just average quality, it will not get rejected at desk rejection level if these things are followed, and you don't waste too much of editor's time, because then straight away what they do is they pass it on to the referees. If they reject it, then some of them will reject it in one sentence. That's not followed. Some of them will reject it in 2-3 sentences, just briefly mention that it doesn't fit into the journal. And in some cases, they also give the detailed reasons, but that's rare. But the idea is not to find out the reasons for rejection, but to avoid rejection. So once you are able to get through the desk rejection stage, come the referees. Now, who are the referees? It is called peer review, but actually it's not peer review, because you know much more about this whole subject than the referees do. At the same time, referees are not paid anything. In fact, I think Journal of Centrum Cathedra may have been the only journal in the world which paid the authors as also the referees. Other journals, in the old days especially, maybe even now, they used to have a submission fee. So firstly, internet was not there. You have to submit your article by post and send say $50 to American Economic Review. Now, those journals for high-level journals, so it's not worthwhile sending to any journal which asks for review for the fee. The other thing that the journals do is ask for article processing charges. Now, most of the predatory journals will ask for article processing charges, but vice versa is not true. Not all the journals which ask for article processing charges will be predatory journals. And for that, there is a particular website from which one can find out whether it's a predatory journal. So coming back to the referees, now the referees have to find fault and show that they have knowledge of the subject. So sometimes, if you have two referees, the comments may be opposite of each other. Sometimes comments are simply absurd. Now, how to deal? One is important thing that has come in is because of the internet. It's important to remain anonymous, because otherwise, if the referee finds that, okay, this author I've heard of and this one I've never heard of, so that may go as a negative thing. At one time in Centrum, the then director research got approval from the Director General, and issued a diktat that we will have a series of working papers. So every author should, prospective author should put in a working paper. And if you don't put in the working paper, we will not consider for giving you the sessions if the paper is published in a journal. So this shows two things. One, which I explained to Fernando de Lesio, who was Director General, that maybe it's good for you, because if you write a paper on leadership, people will, when they Google the subject, they'll find the subject of the referees, find the same subject written by a working paper by Fernando de Lesio, so your chances are increased. But what about people who are unheard of? And he agreed. So it was dropped. But that is something strange that he agreed, because normally the bureaucracies don't agree with anything that you tell them. They are the font of knowledge, and any bureaucracy would say that whatever we've said is right. So that's dealing with bureaucracy sometimes is even more difficult than dealing with the editors and the referees. Then, now how to deal with the absurd comments of the referees? Now, for that, there is a popular, the popular books by maybe 100 years old by Dale Carnegie, like how to win friends and influence people. He says that I don't like to eat earthworms. I mean, obviously nobody likes. He says, I prefer to eat strawberries with cream. But when I go fishing, I put the earthworm in my tackle. Why? Because the fish likes it. So even if you don't like what the referee is saying, somehow you have to swallow your own, you can say either ego or your rightful thoughts, and please the referee. That again becomes an art, because you cannot destroy your paper. At the same time, you have to feed the worms to the referees. So this is the main thing on dealing with the referees. Now, as you expected, let me give the example of one of my papers. Now, genesis of the research idea, I don't really know how most people do it, because my research is usually interdisciplinary. So long back, I had considered meditation, but I was too lazy, so I dropped it. But then all of a sudden, the revolution came in, the mindful revolution. And Buddhist ideas became popular in the West and so on. So I thought that how much is it related to business education? Because its effect to business became well known, because in Davos, it was very difficult to get, for any chief executive to get a place in the lecture by John Kabat-Zinn, who was a great man in mindfulness. He still is. And even though it was very expensive, it was always full. So all the VIPs and in all spheres of life, not just business, were after it, but in business education, it was not known. Some places in school education and all, certain experiments were tried, and then there was some controversy, because in America, people said that this is religious and probably it's not Catholic or it's not Christian or whatever. But basically, in business education, its effect was not known. Now, as far as the research process is concerned, there is a whole lot of research methodology that we teach, which is a science. So as I said, that doing research is a science, and getting published not a science. Now, journal selection was very painful, because first, because the title was mindfulness, I sent it to the journal called Mindfulness, which is a very highly rated journal in psychology. Now, in this case, instead of rejecting it in one sentence, that was also a sentence, the editor wrote that our selection criteria is very high and very few articles submitted are selected. In your case, the way you have measured mindfulness is not correct. And he gave a few examples that why it is not correct. Because the editor has a different way of measuring it. And there are always disputes in science as to which method is better. So it didn't coincide with the editor's method and got rejected. So I thought, okay, so let me put it in some journal which deals with education. Now, again, I did not try for FT50. There are some journals dealing with education FT50. I was concentrating on JCR Q1 because I thought if it gets rejected there, then I'll go down. So in education, again, their criteria for rejection was that your subject is too narrow. We deal with the whole of education, the philosophy of education, etc. But you are just dealing with the MBA, which is a very, very small part of education. So then I sent it to a journal which deals with higher education. Now, in higher education, surprisingly, again, they said the same thing, that your focus is very narrow. You are dealing with MBA, which is a very small part of higher education. Plus, they gave other reason also that it is very, in the beginning of the paper, it is not clear what you want to say. It comes much later. So then finally, I chose you see, the journals have very similar names, so one has to be very careful. So I chose from Q1 at that time. You see, in the month of June, the quota is changed. So I don't know where it is now, but at that time it was in Q1, International Journal for IJME, International Journal for Management Education. They were very fast. Sometimes the editor takes a month either for desk rejection or to passing on to the referees. In this case, within 2 days, maybe he didn't read it or maybe he did, passed on to the referees. Now, referees, one referee said that this article is too short. It's only 5,500 words. Now, in the old days, journals preferred shorter articles because there were printing charges. If your article exceeds so many pages, per page, they will charge a lot. Now, because of the internet, they want longer articles. This was something that I discovered rather late. So that was one objection. Then, again, I mean, this would be, again, I would consider it frivolous. Normally what happens is that when you are writing a paper, you would formulate hypotheses which have to be stated very clearly. You can say H1, H2, H3, H4 or whatever. Now, some people write the whole thing and then say section, hypothesis H1, H2, H3, H4. Some people would give something and then write this leads to H1, then write something, this leads to H2. Now, some of the referees would say, you put all the hypotheses together, what sense does it make? Put them where the hypothesis belongs. So this is like the earthworm thing. Okay, if he says put where the hypothesis belong, you can put it there. Now, the problem here was, one of them said that the Buddhist philosophy that leads to mindfulness has not been explained in full. The other referee said that Buddhist philosophy is not hypothesis, this is only conjectures. So there's no need to explain it in detail. You can only say that this is what they've said. So this contradiction, again, there is no scientific way of pleasing the two referees, but it's an art how to navigate if it is contradictory. Now, why I'm saying is that editors are lazy, that the right thing to do would be, they always write, either you can modify your articles according to the referee, or you can contradict the referees. But if you contradict the referees, the right thing for the editor would be to mediate, see whether your view is right or the referee's view is right. If yours is right, he should accept, or if it is the referee's view is right, he should reject. But that doesn't happen. What they do is they send it back to the referees. Now, very few journals do it. Like there is one trilingual journal called Kiklos, published in Switzerland, a very good economics journal. There they have written that this is what we do. When we get referees' comments, we ask the author. Author may agree or disagree. Then the editor considers both points and decides. But most editors are lazy. They send it back to the referee. And referees never agree with the author, unless it's a minor thing. If it's a clarification, the referee would agree. But even if the referee has made a faulty comment, this is, for instance, you are saying that effect of such and such thing is medium term, and referee says no, it is short term. Then you explain why I am saying it is medium term. The referee is unlikely to agree. So again, it becomes an art to not displease the referee, as also not to destroy the paper. So one should not expect that editor is going to come to your help if you are, that's been my experience, that if you are going to dispute anything with the referees. So some of the experienced authors even start writing by saying, I am extremely grateful for the referees for his great comments, etc., etc. One may not go to that extent, but contradicting the referee or directly or indirectly telling him that he is talking nonsense, which they do sometimes, will not go well with the editors. So this, there was this, I had to expand the paper. I had to mediate between the two referees and parawise give a reply. Some of the referees give suggestions that the author should read also these articles. And if they are giving 10 articles, one of them may be their own, because they want it to be cited. So those articles, I mean, there is no harm in, if they can fit in, you can put extra references. Very few journals limit the number of references. They say they should not be less than 10 and not more than 25. But most journals don't bother, especially after the internet, because it doesn't lead to extra pieces of paper. So it's better to deal with referees and the editors diplomatically rather than technically. So this was my experience in writing this paper. Now, another thing which is talked about more often than practiced, what kind of ethics we should follow. And there was also one very harsh email from our director of research on what we should do and so on. Somehow, Centrum has had a tradition of harsh emails, which would be considered inappropriate in the US, but we have to follow the Latin American traditions. So certain things, like one is duplicate submission. Now, duplicate submission is discouraged by the publishers because editors and referees are unpaid. So it will add to their extra work because your paper has gone to many places. Now, when you but when you are applying for a job, supposing somebody is in PhD, applies to Centrum, applies to Pacifico, applies to ISAN, and so on. Now, he's wasting time of many of the institutions because they'll have to process the application, maybe interview, etc., etc., and then he selects one of 3 or 4. Well, I don't understand how it is unethical, but then if they say so, so be it. But there is another reason why I think duplicate submission should not be done, and that's why I don't do it. It's not a question of ethics, it's a question of practicality. Because before submitting to another journal, you have to work a lot. As I said, you have to modify your paper according to the style of the journal. Then you have, as I said, you have to discover how to quote their papers so that editor is pleased. So once you submitted a paper, instead of wasting time in preparing it for the next paper, that time should be used for another paper. So it's not practically worthwhile to do duplicate submission. Then comes the question of salami slicing, that can you divide your research into 2 parts and publish 2 papers? Again, there is we used to have a German professor who sliced his PhD into 2 parts and published in 2 papers in an FT50 Journal of Business Ethics, and it was widely appreciated. It is quite common, especially for if it's a good PhD. Sometimes people write clearly that this is the chapter 1, this is based on my chapter 1 and 2 of my thesis, because they want to do it later. Now, again, for practical reasons, salami slicing is not worthwhile. The reason is that then your paper becomes not big enough. And if you divide it in 2 parts, both may get rejected. So it's better to avoid it and publish as 1 paper so that the chances of getting it published are too high. Now, another practice that Centrum does not consider unethical, but I do, is that people form cartel. They have co-authors. So if you have written a paper alone, you can add 2 or even more co-authors from other universities, even if they have not contributed or they've contributed very little. Even though the journals clearly write that a co-author should have contributed this much at this stage, but nobody's going to check that. And when they write, they put you as second author. So you get sessions there. So some of the, this can be done by foreign authors because they have contacts in the universities. For Peruvian authors, it is very difficult. Second thing that is done is when the cartel is very big. You might even see papers with 20 authors. And if earlier they had stopped people, no sessions for if there are more than 3, but now they've introduced, you get 10%. So if you are a member of that, so a large number of papers you can produce. But so now, instead of talking too much about this, let's move to something else. Like, what are the alternatives to salami slicing? One is that basically, first thing is that you write a paper. Now, most of us write, very few of us would be writing theoretical papers. Most of us write empirical papers. Now, in empirical papers, you quite often you have a cross-section data. You write an article. Article will not be, because you're not writing in an econometric journal or operations research or whatever, but by and large, the article, a lot will depend on the literature of it. the introduction part, how important this is, etc., etc. And then you would be doing your analysis and whether the analysis fits the results. Again, if you say that the everything was not significant, now in theory it should be good research that you found something is not significant, but then it will not get published. So you find something significant and then only it becomes a publishable paper. Now, but then there are mediating variables. One of the best method, probably according to econometricians, is to find instrument variables. That can be, the methodology is not very old. It started in agricultural economics in the 40s or so, but now it's come elsewhere. So if instrument variable is available, you can find those and then it could be a new paper. The problem that comes with instrument variables are that they're very difficult to find, but in which case mediating variables, there are other methods. And for those, I think probably everyone who attended the presentation by Jose Antonio, he explained very well what is a mediating variable with diagrams and literature survey and all that, how to handle mediating variable. There was a minor problem that moderating variables were not considered, but that was sorted out by Sergio, how to go about that. But the way it was explained, the use of mediating variables, that was very good. Like, when is a mediating variable significant? When is it, its effect is significant? When is the direct effect is significant? That is very, that was explained very well. In my paper, also, I used the same technique, but I did not explain it so well because I was more focused on what is Buddhist thought, what is mindfulness, and how to measure what the student has learned. So this part was not as well explained as Jose Antonio has done. Now, but then one can move, which is very important, forwards and backwards. In the first paper, through one mediating variable, I quantified that mindful, because you see, there's been a lot of research. In fact, a lot of money has been made by experts of mindfulness in reducing stress. It started some time back, mainly by John Kabat-Zinn, who combined mindfulness with stress reduction in a medical school, because he was both. He had done a PhD in neuroscience under a Nobel Prize winning scientist, and he had also studied mindfulness under a great Buddhist scholar who died only recently. So he had knowledge of both. He started that, and now, of course, he's addresses in Davos and so on. So his basic thing was stress reduction. On the other hand, it is also known that, it's somewhat obvious that if a student is stressed, he would not be good academically. But then maybe mindfulness has direct effect also. So that's what I tried to quantify. How much is the direct effect? How much is the effect of mindfulness through stress reduction and so on. But now one way to expand now the second paper, I thought that academic brilliance has gone too far. And the way our brilliant people have destroyed the financial system and the way they are destroying the business people, even the professors, especially those in finance, are getting a bad name that you are teaching immorality to students. So I went into the totally different part, ethics, and then there is likely to be a different mediating variable. And then you can take two things together also, whether it leads through to ethical behavior, yes or no. And there are various methods of finding ethical behavior and various types and so on. And whether it academics also. So that is one expansion. The other expansion is backward. How do you get mindfulness? I have not written that paper so far, but the way, there are many methods, but a very common method is yoga practice. Now, yoga practice affects mindfulness. Mindfulness affects something else. Does yoga practice also directly affect that variable? So that is a backward integration. Now, this is not salami slicing because this is completely new research. So what I say is that once research is published, just don't open champagne and end of it. That research must be utilized for further research, which will be better and more sophisticated. So instead of going through unethical practices like finding co-authors and joining those cohort of 20 authors, etc., there are also proper methods of increasing the research output. But again, that's more of an art rather than science. So it doesn't come into research methodology. So another method is cross-section to panel data, because with time, panel data becomes available. So long back, I had done research in Cambodia. Now, Cambodia had a very unfortunate past. The most homicidal Marxist organization called Khmer Rouge was there. In fact, it is often said that supposing Sendero Luminoso had come into power, they might have reached that level, but that never happened. Now, in that kind of, and the thing was, the only thing that they were focusing on was irrigation, that water economy should be developed. So they depopulated the cities, put everyone in the village that you dig canals and we will increase rice production. But because the engineers were also killed, what they did was they just made a map, 1 kilometer squares for main canals and 100 meters for smaller canals. Now that regime ended, and there was talk of let people do it. So the idea was that in such a society, can participation work? Now, there were many other things, and finally, it was found that yes, even in that society, the participation can increase productivity under such and such circumstances. But then that was way back. Then comes more data becomes available because you can go on checking every year. These days, fortunately, in the old days, the biggest problem of research used to be getting data. Now, the biggest problem is surfeit of data. There's so much of data that what to reject is a problem. But the plus point is that we do get data. Now, supposing you see it year-wise, then there'll be two types of effects. One would be state-specific effect, and one would be time-specific effect, and third would be the interaction between the two. You can always make an equation. Then you have to test, because that equation will have certain problems. You'll have to test for endogeneity and so on. But finally, you can, as I'm trying to do, I haven't done it yet, somewhat this type of data. Now, this gray area is 5% this side and that side. Now, if you find this type of thing, then you can say that the effects are more or less permanent, at least in the medium term. Long term, nobody knows. As Keen said, in the long term, we are all dead. But we do like to see not just the short-term effect, but also the long-term effect, or rather medium-term effect. So this is how another the research can expand. So now we go to short term and long term. I mean, a professor has to decide whether I want to do short term or am I planning for a long term thing. Now, quite often we say that why do research? Because research, that's how the institutions justify expenditure on research. They say that research feeds into teaching. Otherwise, the undergrads especially say, why should we pay for research? We have such a huge fees. We should be taught for that. Why are you wasting money on research? So we say that, okay, research feeds into teaching. But that's another hypocrisy. Research never feeds into teaching. You should never teach your student what you are researching. What happens is that there's a trade-off. I mean, everybody has just 24 hours. You have to limited time as an academic. You have to do teaching and research both. So if somebody is focusing on short term, teaching is a good idea. One should do only that minimum research which is required by the employer, because teaching is stable. You can't, research is very unstable. Like when I joined Centrum, my publication in what at that time used to be called ISI category, in yearly, minimum, maximum was 5 and minimum was 0. So this is that kind of instability, which is obviously not a good thing. Teaching is very stable. You'll get the same classes. So research should be minimized. But the long-term research is better because then you'll get more papers. The other difference is the intellectual development. Now, intellectual development, normally people say that young people should be more attuned towards intellectual development, because you become a good teacher, but then beyond that, what? I mean, there is a limit up to which you can teach. In research, it is unlimited. You can go on becoming better and better and better. So one strain of thought is, with which I don't agree, is that at a younger age, one should do intellectual development, and the later age, one should prefer stability. I would, what actually happens is that later age, the neurons in the brain start firing less, and it is even more important to focus on intellectual development. So that is another thing, that in the long term, one has to minimize teaching, because it is hypocrisy to say that research feeds into teaching. Actually, they are opposite of each other. Of course, teaching is a noble profession. I mean, from that point of view, it's a good thing to teach. There can be two views on it. The practitioners have a saying, it's difficult to understand in Spanish because actual translation may not be possible. But English, it goes something like this: those who can, do. Those who can't, teach. So one may not agree with that. But the fact remains that there is only a limit up to which you can become a good teacher. Whereas in case of research, it is unlimited. Now, another short-term and long-term thing is the language. Because learning a language is very difficult. I mean, learning to think in a language, which I found to my cost. And so first thing one should do is that never bother about the third language, because English is now preeminent, far above any other language. And Spanish is number 2, but far below. In the old days, it was French. It was the language of fashion. It was the language of diplomacy, etc., etc. But now Spanish has taken over. So at one time, Fernando wanted that we should design a trilingual program. We had a bilingual with the MSN. So I asked why. He says every business school is offering bilingual, so we got to distinguish ourselves from others. So let's start a trilingual. I said it's a very, very bad idea, and even learning two languages is bad enough. So third is be terrible. So and that's the problem. We have one collaboration with the French-speaking university in Canada. They will not give an MBA degree unless you pass their intermediate level of French. So that collaboration is on paper. We show we are internationalizing, but not a single student has got an MBA from that institution. Now, the other thing is professional development. So, but let me see this. In 1905, Einstein wrote 4 papers in Annals of Physics, all in German. And at least 3 out of these led to Nobel Prize. There was a lot of, the Nobel Prize was getting delayed because of certain internal problems and so on, but ultimately he got it on the basis of this, which were all written in German. He, at that time, he probably even didn't know English, or at least he was not capable of writing in English. How times have changed. In 2013, Thomas Piketty wrote a book in French. It was just like a mediocre book. Nobody noticed it. 2014, somehow somebody who may be knowing French discovered it, translated it, and published it in the US. And he became such a bestseller that it came on top of New York Times. Nobel laureate who writes in New York Times said that this is the best book in a decade, and so on. And it was unknown book just 1 year back. So that is the unfortunate thing that has happened, because you see, one language should not dominate the world. This is bad for culture. But then business, we are practical people. So culturally it is bad, but in practical sense, it is good. So this professional development, one is conferences. People say that you meet your academic soulmates in conferences, etc., etc. But the definition of conferences, I mean, how does a conference differ from holiday? The difference is that in case of conference, your employer pays for it. So it is good to go to conferences, especially if they are in a good location. As far as the other thing is the training courses that Centrum organizes. If they are compulsory, you got to attend. But otherwise, if you are in the short term, one should attend. But in the long term, it's bad. Because on the one side, you're learning the technical side. On the other side, you are forgetting to think in the language in which you will be writing. Of course, the ultimate thing could be like people in Singapore. They all speak Chinese, but the moment they enter their university, they start thinking in English. It's like, for them, it's like a mental switch. That stage may not reach. It's very difficult. Of course, in India, it happens that the moment people enter their university, they start thinking in English. So, but it may not happen in Peru or other countries. But at least, for those who are thinking in long term, one can think of avoiding professional development, because it's simply not worthwhile and could even be harmful. So this is all I had to say. these are the points. I thought it will be very short, but probably it's become a little longer. And now maybe Sergio can explain things further, because as I said, that one doesn't have to agree with any of these points. Thank you.